Remember when toilet paper vanished from stores last year? That might just be the tip of the iceberg in what's shaping up to be a historic international supply chain crisis. Images and videos of empty department store shelves, as well as massive shipping vessels stranded off the coast of California, are going viral on social media. At the Los Angeles and Long Beach ports, which handle 40% of all shipping containers entering the United States, there are roughly 100 ships waiting around to enter and unload. And there are dozens of ships arriving each week. Things are so bad that Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida just announced that the Jacksonville Port Authority will gladly welcome vessels stranded in California, even meeting there with incentive packages. As the American economy recovers from COVID-19 and the lockdown-induced recession, supply chains have clearly not yet caught up, causing major headaches for businesses and everyday consumers alike. But the story doesn't begin at your local Walmart or Target, or in California's major port cities. The source of the current supply chain problem is actually half a world away, in China and other Asian industrial hubs. As COVID-19 started spreading from Wuhan, the Chinese government quickly locked down its population, which also meant the sudden closure of factories in late January of 2020. Economists already knew what would come next, a massive disruption in global supply chains. When China got hit with the SARS epidemic in 2002, the financial markets barely noticed. But over the past 2 decades, China doubled its share of trade with the rest of the world and quadrupled its GDP. Under pressure to cut costs, firms in the United States began outsourcing production to China and other foreign countries, sometimes relying on suppliers in dozens of nations at a time. Let's take a look at Apple. The hundreds of components that go into one iPhone come from 43 countries and 6 continents. From the computer chip alone, fabrication happens in Taiwan, followed by packaging and testing in the Philippines, and then assembly in China. And of course, Apple's intermediary companies have intermediaries of their own, resulting in a tangled web of raw materials, labor, and shipping. To be clear, the supply chain crisis that began in 2020 never really got solved. For the past 18 months, leading companies have cut production due to a lack of manufacturing inputs, most notably car companies like GM, Toyota, and Ford, which are getting slammed by a serious semiconductor shortage. But as the global economy bounced back, consumer spending in the United States and other developed countries skyrocketed. Now there's demand that the still fragile supply chains can't quite handle, especially as Asian countries like Malaysia and Vietnam ramp up their quarantines all over again. At home, Americans have been hesitant to get back to their jobs. Overall employment in the United States is still 3% lower than pre-COVID levels, and the labor force participation rate has flatlined. In sectors like trucking, which is crucial for getting products into stores, there's a driver shortage so severe that many high schools are now launching truck driving classes for their students. An economic crisis of this magnitude could threaten America's economic recovery, especially heading into the holiday season when firms depend on retail sales for huge portions of their yearly earnings. So we'd expect the Biden administration and other officials to be helping out as much as possible, right? A recent report showed that Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, who is responsible for the federal government's infrastructure programs, has quietly been on paid paternity leave for the past 2 months. A spokesperson for the agency confirmed that the former Democratic presidential contender was mostly offline for the first 4 weeks after adopting twins. And when Mayor Pete finally did manage to come into work, he brushed off the media's concerns about supply chains, instead pointing to surges in consumer demand as a positive for his boss's presidency.
Part of the reason we are where we are is that the president successfully brought this economy out of the teeth of a recession.
So you're saying
People are buying more than ever before. We're seeing record goods coming through our ports. The demand is there, which is great news. It represents a policy success.
At least Buttigieg is answering questions. President Biden himself dodged reporters after demanding that the private sector step up.
And if the private sector doesn't step up, we're going to call them out and ask them to act.
At other times, the White House has been even more blatantly dismissive of Americans' concerns. Press Secretary Jen Psaki joked about the tragedy of the treadmill that's delayed.
Tragedy of the treadmill that's delayed.
And Buttigieg joked about people who show up at the mall on Christmas Eve having even more challenges this year.
I think there's always been 2 kinds of Christmas shoppers. There's the ones who have all their list completed by Halloween, and then there's people like me who show up at the mall on Christmas Eve. If you're in that latter bucket, obviously there's going to be more challenges.
Responses from the media have been even more condescending. Progressive economist Paul Krugman wrote for the New York Times that the supply chain crisis is just more proof for why we need vaccine mandates. And at the Washington Post, Michael Maynard told Americans not to whine or rant about the shortages, encouraging them to instead try lowering expectations. As the White House and the establishment media brush off concerns, analysts now worry that the supply chain woes could last well into 2022. There seems to be no immediate end in sight for the labour shortage, the overseas production hiccups, and the other underlying issues causing the crisis. And without a doubt, consumers won't be too pleased.